Right. Good. Okay. Well, welcome all to the first SustainNET webinar of the spring, of the summer term here at Edge Hill University. It's good to see a load of people here, up to 28 participants so far. I'm Paul Applin. I'm based in the geography department at Edge Hill. I'm one of the SustainNET team. And I, for my sins, now have core responsibility for chairing the webinar series. So you might see me from time to time. It's a great pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues here today, Sven Batke and Anne Oxbrough, and they're going to run through their parts of the seminar in turn, starting off with Sven. So just to let you know a little bit about Sven, Dr. Sven Batke is now Senior Lecturer in Biology, joined Edge Hill in 2017, I think, and before that undertook a PhD in Tropical Plant Ecology at Trinity College Dublin, and postdoced subsequently at University College Dublin in Ireland. His research focuses on especially how climate change is affecting plant atmospheric water feedbacks. And Sven is Fellow of the Linnaean Society, member of the British Ecological Society and Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. Sven's going to kick us off in a moment. And also a pleasure to welcome Anne. Dr. Anne Oxbrough is now Reader in Ecology in our Biology department at Edge Hill. Anne's been here since 2012, and prior to that, she undertook PhD in Ecology, also in Ireland at University College Cork, and then postdoced in Canada as a Marie Curie International Fellow. Anne's research focuses on, among other things, sustainable management of forest ecosystems, and she's especially well known for her spider work. She's a specialist in arthropod ecology. Anne is Fellow of the Royal Entomological Society, coordinates the International Union of Forest Research Organisations Forest Biodiversity Group, and the Royal Entomological Society's Special Interest Group on Forest Insects. So with that, we'll move to the webinar today, titled Sustainable Forest Management, Canopy Biology. Over to you, Sven.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Paul. Okay, I'm going to start you off with this quote, which was written by Alfred Wallace in one of his journals in 1878, so quite some time ago. And during some of his expeditions, especially to parts of South America, he described forest canopies, and his first experience of forest canopies he encountered in, I think it was in Peru. And he said overhead at a height perhaps of 100 feet is almost an unbroken foliage formed by the meeting together of these great trees and their interlacing branches. And it's this canopy is usually so dense that but an undistinct glimmer of the sky is to be seen. And even the intense tropical sunlight only penetrates to the ground, subdued and broken up into scattered fragments. It is a world in which man seems an intruder and where he feels overwhelmed. I think that really summarizes quite nicely how early explorers started feeling when they started going into these tropical collections. And these kind of like tropical forests were immense for them in comparison to some of these researchers that might have come from temperate zones where forests are relatively small in comparison. And when they started kind of like visiting and discovering some of these rainforests, all they could do is look up, only guess and envision what might be up there for them. They had no ways of climbing up these trees unless they found someone that is really skilled tree climber and is willing to risk their life. But apart from that, they really struggled with accessing these forests and studying these forests in the first place. So the question is, so why would we actually bother studying these systems? Why would we go ahead and studying these systems? I get a bit of interference. I don't know about other people. Seems to be some noise interference. If people could switch off their microphones, that would be lovely. If we can get people to switch off their microphones briefly, thank you much. Just so we don't have any background noise, because it's quite difficult to hear myself then. Thank you. So why would you go ahead and studying these systems? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. They are very high diversity, and I'm gonna show you a graph in a second that kind of demonstrates that quite nicely. So they're quite species rich. There's not only just trees up there, there's also organisms that live within these trees. And in fact, some of the richest diversity of plants and animals in forests actually grow and live in the canopy. So when you walk through a forest, on the bottom of a forest floor, you might only see a small fraction of the actual wildlife that lives in the forest. So in order to kind of like sustainably manage forests, it's really important to be able to study forest ecosystems and forest canopies. They're also very physiologically active. A lot of the physiological processes that happens within a forest happens in the canopy. We're talking about photosynthesis, gas exchange to the atmosphere, changes in water distribution from the soil through these plants and into the atmosphere, which regulates a lot of our global ecosystems, global climate patterns as well. So they really have a strong contribution to global climate cycles, including the nutrient cycle, water cycle, carbon cycle as well. An important source, sink actually, not a source, a sink of carbon. And they're incredibly complex from an ecological point of view. Some of these ancient trees in particular that have been a long time around, they are in some cases so ecologically complex that we still don't fully understand their role in the forest systems. And all we can do is guess or start learning about these systems now that we have the kind of like skills, expertise, and technology to access these systems more readily. And of course, they're important to us, not only from an ecological point, from a global cycling point, if you will, but also they give us joy. And that's something we shouldn't really underappreciate, that forest canopies can be very joyful and in some ways spiritual places that can help people to overcome, for example, mental illness. So we really need to appreciate these forest systems, and we need to better understand these systems. So just to give you an idea, what I meant by, well, they're really biodiverse hotspots or globally important hotspots. So this is a graph that was published in 2017 by Batke et al. And what you can see here on the left-hand side, on the left-hand y-axis, you see a height of trees in meters. Okay, so just from 0 meters all the way to 40 meters. And this is average tree height across the latitude. So you have the latitudes here. Okay, so you have the tropics around here as around zero latitude. And on the other y-axis, the red y-axis, you have mean biodiversity index. Don't worry about the scale for now. All it's basically telling you, the higher you go up the scale, the more species you get, broadly speaking. And you can see that kind of like green line, including the confidence interval, the deviation you get there, kind of like traces along the latitudinal belt, showing you quite clearly that the tallest tree in the world tend to be around the equatorial belt. So in tropical forests, what you kind of expect and probably know already. With some exceptions, we obviously get some really tall trees. For example, in California, our redwoods, our tallest trees in the world. And also some in the southern hemisphere where you kind of like go to, for example, New Zealand or Australia as well, where you get some really tall trees as well. But you can see that red line traces that green line relatively well, at least up to the lower latitudes. So you go to the higher latitudes in either direction, it kind of like changes over, because obviously you don't have any trees in the Arctic Circle, for example. Okay, so hence why you get that upside down effect. But you can really clearly see the taller the trees are, the more biodiversity you get. Okay, because it gets more structurally complex, and therefore more stuff can live in them. So that's a really important message I wanted to kind of like mention here. Also, it needs to be remembered that forest canopies differ very, very widely. What you're probably familiar with here in the Northern Hemisphere, in kind of like temperate zones, is a picture like this. This is like a typical oak tree in a park, okay? You can see there's loads of foliage in there. It's a big tree, very impressive tree. But if you look at the branches, there's not much living on those branches. If you go a bit closer, there might be maybe the odd bryophyte like moss or some lichens, or maybe the odd bug crawling around as well. If you, however, compare that to tropical locations, it looks very, very different. The canopy is completely covered in this really lush carpet of vegetation. And you can only imagine how many creepy crawlies are in there. And Ed loves these places just because there's so many creepy crawlies. And I love those places because of all the plants you get in there. And I'm going to talk about these plants later on as well. So these kind of like plant havens in a way kind of like also contributes to a lot of the diversity we see with regards to invertebrates. And this is an older paper now by Elwood and Foster in 2004, was published in Nature, which shows this relationship quite nicely. So they looked at these epiphytic ferns. So epiphyte means plants growing on top of another tree. Okay, epiphytic being on top of. And what they were looking at, how many leaves do you actually get, and how that correlates with how many insects you find, okay, invertebrates. So here at the bottom, you can see log number of leaves, so how many leaves you get. And here you have the number of invertebrates, so the biomass of invertebrates in grams, okay? And you can see this really strong relationship. So the more leaves you get, the more biomass of inverts you get as well. And we'll be talking about invertebrate ecology in forest canopies, in forests in general later on. So, well, one of the questions then, how do you get up there in the first place? So back in the days, you remember, they really struggled. They couldn't get up there. They had maybe some local people they sent over. Half of them probably died on the undertaking trying to get an orchid down from one of these trees or collecting some fruits from a tree. So people had to be more innovative back in the day. And there was Edward John Henry Corner, which you might have heard of. He was actually the director of the Botanic Garden in Singapore. He was originally, I think, from Essex, if I remember correctly. And he was kind of like a really strong figure and who started developing some ways to access forest canopies, because he was really interested in writing books about trees in general. And he needed leaf samples to be collected for him in order to do his illustrations and his dichotomous keys to describe those trees. So what he saw actually some of the locals doing is training monkeys to collect coconuts on the beach. And he kind of like thought, that's a great idea. How about I get them to retrain the monkeys to get me some leaf or botanical samples down. So he started doing that, but it was more hit or miss more than anything, because he had more of these monkeys actually eating his botanical collections than actually bringing them down safely. So that obviously didn't kind of like catch on very well. There's still some people training animals to bring, for example, rope over the trees or all sorts, but it didn't really catch on very well. It's also very costly and ethically, a lot of considerations there as well. So other ways you can use leathers. A leather is quite easy to use. Some local peoples might build their own ladders from the surrounding vegetation using trees and branches or lianas as well. More modern kind of like ecologists, if they do, for example, gas analysis images, or for example, this person here has a gas analyzer around his neck, this little box there, if you can see that. And this little box kind of like allows him to measure photosynthesis in the canopy. But as you can see, ladders, they're quite bulky, you have to carry them somewhere, and of course, you can only reach the canopy to a certain height. Binoculars, quite often used for primate studies or bird surveys, sometimes for vegetation surveys as well. But again, you can imagine being on the ground and looking up, you might miss a lot, okay? So people started developing these ideas, well, how about we go and study forest canopies and learn about the sustainability and the sustainable management of forest canopies by going over with a balloon or a sledge, a canopy sledge, we call them. And one of the first ones that was very successful was Rideau, the scheme designed by Halley in 1991, which is the example here, you can see the balloon there. And it has this kind of like canopy raft or platform that is kind of like lowered on top of the canopy, where researchers can descend down, collect the data, they can even climb into the lower canopy. But again, costly. I mean, flying a balloon, you need to be quite specialized. You can only fly when the weather is perfect conditions. And you need to fly quite a distance because you can't blow up a balloon in the middle of a rainforest. So, there's a lot of constraints there as well, but it can be quite useful. Very popular, and it was kind of like pioneered by Alan Smith, a fern taxonomist in Berkeley University. He's currently in Berkeley, but almost retired. And he started developing the idea of using cranes in Panama. So he used construction cranes to study the forest canopies. The only problem you have with that, you have a little gondola you can lower up and down into the canopy. It's quite stationary. When you put up a crane, you're not going to take it anywhere else quickly over the afternoon. So when you put it up, you probably leave it there. And the costs are immense in some cases to actually maintain some of these forest canopies. Currently there are 11, 12 actually, in fact, but one is out of action because they can't afford keeping it running at the moment. It's in Brazil. And it costed between 1 to 5 million a year to run one of these cranes, just to run them, which is quite a lot of money, which you probably could spend in a better way, if you ask me. Other ways of kind of like studying the forest canopies by using walkways, platforms, very common in the film industry, where they use platforms like permanent or semi-permanent perches, where they kind of like put up cameras or camera traps to kind of like film wildlife or collect plants, or if they have an experiment, if you have a walkway, for example, or platform set up, you can always come back and study them frequently. So you don't have to kind of like go through all the hassle to get up every single time, for example, using rope climbing techniques to keep climbing up. You can just walk up, for example, a canopy walkway to your sample site and look at your organism you're studying. So there's a lot of advantages, but again, it's very costly. You need expert people to put it up for you. Then more kind of like modern technology is being used more frequently now as kind of like drones and aerial vehicles as well. I have kind of like this hate-love relationships with drones in forest canopies. Just because I'm not a very good pilot, and the people I have worked with are not very good pilots either, because they're scientists, and scientists tend to be quite, they don't have opposable thumbs, I don't think, when it comes to these things. At least the amount of time I wasted rescuing aerial vehicles or like drones from the forest because they got stuck somewhere wasn't worth the investment. So it's actually easier just to climb the tree yourself rather than using drones. But it can, again, depending on the questions, the research question, it can be very, very powerful tools, especially if you use them above the canopy. And then pretty much lastly, but not least, we use rope climbing techniques. And rope climbing techniques were kind of really popularized during the 80s, in the early 80s, by a book written by Mitchell called Reaching the Forest Roof. And in this book, he firstly described how he accessed the forest canopies using kind of like industrial, like a combination of industrial and kind of like caving rope maneuvers. But again, back in the day, it wasn't very safe. Some of the equipment they used were rather sketchy. And a lot of people did die in the first few years of canopy exploration. But since then, we have come an awful long way in allowing people to safely access forest canopies using rope climbing techniques. And this is actually from our climbing course. We're running an Edgehill as well. We're actually having a canopy biology module where we also teach students how to safely access the forest canopy and sample in the forest canopy as well. It's probably the cheapest and most versatile way of getting around the canopy. However, you don't always have to go up in the trees. So in some cases, it's actually worthwhile using fogging techniques, for example, collecting inverts, and Anne is going to talk about that as well. Or you might not necessarily have to go all the way up for other reasons as well. So there's alternative ways. So if you don't have to get up, don't bother getting up because it's quite costly and quite time consuming. But if you do have to get up, probably rope climbing is probably the best way of getting around the canopy. So what lives up there? Well, an awful lot of plants, as I mentioned earlier. And my personal passion and interest is on mechanically dependent plants, which are plants that have been living in the forest canopy as dependents, are dependent on the forest canopy. And we have kind of different groups of mechanically dependent plants. Some of these are called epiphytes, which are like example pictures you can see here, like ferns, cacti in some cases as well, bromeliads, which are the same family as pineapples. Okay, so pineapples, most of those species in pineapples are actually epiphytic. And then you see this lovely little orchid, and it's tiny. You can see the finger there, how tiny these things are. If you're using binoculars, you wouldn't be able to see that. So these are kind of like true epiphytes. They spend the entire life cycle in the tree. You have things like hemiepiphytes that started life in the tree and then eventually grow down to the bottom of the tree, like for example, some of these clusia species. They have big fruits as well, so if they do fall on your head, that hurts quite a lot, hence why we wear helmets. Strangler figs, you're probably familiar with, like fig trees. They started growing on top of a tree, send their roots down, eventually constrict the host, and the host dies. Okay, and that's a kind of like an example of a really nice fig tree kind of like taking over this ancient temple here. So they look like they have like little walking legs, but they're quite important parts of these forest ecosystems. Then we have things like nomadic vines. You might be familiar with Monstra, our cheese plants. You might have in your own home. I've actually one behind me while we're talking here. Quite common. They're nomadic vines because they start growing from the forest floor into the canopy, but then lose detachment to the soil and then keep moving away and then regaining detachment elsewhere. So they can actually move between trees. So if you're ever being asked whether plants actually do move, they're not all stationary. Well, then none of them are, but with regards to actually a plant moving, this is probably a good example of how plants can move in a canopy. So you have these monsters, philodendrons or anthurium species, which are also common house plants, a lot of these. Then, of course, our climbers, we are familiar with probably our Araliaceae over here, our ivy, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere, but also kind of some of these really distinct, lovely flowers, like these passion flowers, for example, or these Macania species, which are kind of very typical kind of like elements for these forest systems. And then we have our heavy parasites, our mistletoes, for example. Okay, and in the tropics we have a gazillion of different mistletoes. One of the problems is the number of people that actually study these epiphytic plants or these mechanically dependent plants is quite low. There's not that many of us doing it, and so we started kind of like calling in 2018 a consortium together in Germany, in Marburg. But we kind of like tried to get for Central and South America the majority of people together that actually study epiphytes and forest canopies and really bring together all our localized data sets to try to understand these systems a bit better and actually make recommendations for sustainable forest management as well. So as part of this kind of like workshop, we had 27 participants from 11 different countries, and we kind of really tried to bring our data together to better understand these systems. So what we have so far is we have actually found that by bringing our data together, we have over 32,000 species of epiphytic plants in our data set now. And globally, there's about 9% of all plants grow on top of trees. Just to give you an idea, 9% of all plants grow on top of trees, which is staggering. So we found we have about 32,000 species in our checklist at the moment, sampled from over 40,000 trees. Where we have information about the abundance, how many of there are there, how much area they're covering, and how much biomass they're actually taking up in a forest canopy, and other information about where they're growing as well. So we have this kind of like initiative now where we invite people that have databases to contribute to ours, so we can publish like large kind of like important papers. For example, like this one that came out last year, it was it last year, 2019 it was, where we kind of like looked at the assemblages of epiphytes in the neotropics. And this map kind of really nicely shows you the species richness. So the darker blue it gets, the more species there are. So especially like places like Mexico or also parts of the Brazilian rainforest as well, quite species rich with regards to epiphytes. More recently, I just got this paper accepted on also Monday, I think it was, which I wrote together with some of my students and a collaborator in Honduras. But we looked at, whether, for example, the plants that do live in forests, especially ferns, how they're affected by climate change projections. And for Honduras, we know that gonna be seeing a 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, which is probably will probably relate to globally, at least we know, to a 50% geographical range expansion of 8% of all global species by 2030. So species actually changing their range where they're growing by about 8%. By 2030, that's what we're predicting. However, we didn't know anything about Honduras or these mountains in Honduras. So we kind of like went to the tallest mountain in Honduras, in Salaque National Park, and did like a transect where we surveyed loads of plants in these transects. And we had a look at how climate change differences based on IPCC predictions would affect our plant species. So you can see here, the current line is the blue line. You can see precipitation on the right and temperature on the left. And then these different other colored lines are different scenarios, so different extreme scenarios. So the RCP 2.6 is kind of like the lower range scenario, so probably more or less best case scenario, and then the 8.5 is like worst case scenario. Okay, hence why this gray line is always above here in temperature or below. So we have a decrease in precipitation, so rainfall and increase in temperature in these places. So just as a kind of like the final slide to kind of like show you some of these results, we found over 160 different epiphytic and terrestrial ferns on this mountain, which is about more than double than all of the ferns combined for the whole of the UK and Ireland, which is mind-blowing. And that was just one little nature reserve over there. And what we found was, and you can see that from the panel here on this graph on the left-hand side, the blue lines are the current distribution of these species. And you can see that dashed line going down, this vertical dashed line going down. Okay, this dashed line shows you where the top of the mountain is. Okay, so any species that fall over to the other side, the right-hand side, means they're either going to lose completely their entire habitat if they're completely on the right-hand side, or at least part of their range distribution across an elevation gradient. And what we found is that 63 species are expected to shift their range either fully or partially over the top of the mountain. And you can see if you can't go anywhere as a plant, you're just going to go extinct unless you can disperse somewhere else. So it was quite a key paper to get out to kind of like make hopefully recommendations to forest managers in these systems. So this is some of the research we're doing in the department with regards to forest systems as well, and we're in the process of actually helping with writing a government document to kind of like give some recommendation how you could conserve some of these species and make sure from a forestry management point of view, you know, how you kind of like move, for example, help species to move to some assisting moving, for example, of some of these more threatened species. So I'm going to hand you over now to Anne, who's going to be talking about some of her work she has been doing. So Anne, you should be able to share, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Sven. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all hear me. I'm sure I'll see a message pop up if you can't. So for my bit of the talk, I'm going to give a little bit of a background on sustainable forest management, and then give a sort of a mini case study on some canopy work that I've been involved with in the past when I was a researcher over in Ireland. Okay, so sustainable forest management, what's it all about? We're obviously in a group here that's all about sustainability. So I thought I'd give us a bit of background to that. So pre-1992, the global approach to forest management was one of sustained yield, largely. So you've had a forest that wasn't being managed at all, in which case it was probably being ignored, or you had a forest that was under a sustained yield management approach. And that meant that the whole emphasis of forest management was all about the economic side, the economic output. So the timber output, or perhaps another type of output that you would get from that forest if they kept game in it or something like that. So it's sustained yield. How can you sustain your yield over multiple rotations of that forest? So your forest, you know, is established, grows, gets to the end, cut down, the timber's used, and then it's replanted or allowed to naturally regenerate. So that's a sustained yield paradigm. Following 1992, something major happened. Some of you might be aware of what happened in 1992. It was the Rio Earth Summit, where the CBD, or Convention of Biological Diversity, was first brought together, and in the following years, soon after that, was signed by nearly every country in the world. I think the only places that haven't signed it, apart from the US, unfortunately, which is the only big one that hasn't, is the Holy See, like the Vatican City, and somewhere else really small. So if a country is a signatory to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, you are duty bound to manage your environmental resources in a sustainable way. You have to do that. That's what you said you do. And off the back of that, countries started to explore how they would actually manage their natural ecosystems in that way. And first of all, you have to identify what that actually means. So you go from a sustained yield approach to sustainable forest management. So you go to one area of consideration, which is economic, and you bring in two further ones. So sustainable forest management has three main pillars to it. Economic outputs, you're not going to forget about that. You're not going to forget that the forestry industry to many countries, including the UK, is a significant industry, employs many thousands of people. In the UK, I think it's upwards of 40,000 people directly employed, and that doesn't include the people that are indirectly employed, and the millions of pounds that are made. So you don't ignore that. That becomes part of your new management system that also includes environmental factors and environmental considerations. So how can you manage a forest to include biodiversity, species of conservation interest, ecosystem functions and ecosystem services, like all the kind of range of ecosystem services provided by forests, such as preventing erosion and things like that. And then you also have the social aspects and cultural aspects, and they're important in many countries as well. And I think in the last 12 months, we've probably, perhaps members of the general public have seen more than ever the importance of natural areas and how important they are to people socially to actually be in them. So it's not all about the value, the monetary value, or the functional value that you can put on something. It's also the social value. And in many countries, forests have a strong cultural value as well. So sustainable forest management is a balance of these three pillars. And that's what we've been moving towards in Britain since mid-90s. So say 95, 96 is when they started putting all these types of things in place. And in Ireland, where we're going to be, this case studies on a similar sort of time frame, maybe from 2000 onwards. And if you think about some of the forests we have in the UK in terms of commercial plantation forests, where there's lots of planting going on, a lot of them these days are managed very heavily also for the social side of sustainable forest management. So you'll be able to go to forests if you've been to Delamere Forest, which is fairly local to here, or Gisborne Forest. They're big areas where they're really actively encouraging people to go in them. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. That's a relatively new thing, and it's relatively new in terms of the amount of income that's being brought in from that for the Forestry Commission. Okay, so just move that bar down there. Okay, so forest management, who cares? Why should we care? Obviously, I'm going to talk a bit more today about the biodiversity side and why that's important. Is it just about having nature for the sake of nature? I mean, I think many people, including myself, would argue that we should preserve things for future generations just because they have a value beyond any poundage that you can put on it. But it goes beyond that as well. Biodiversity is fundamental to how ecosystems function. So an ecosystem does not function well if it doesn't have a range of different organisms carrying out a range of different functional roles. So if you think about animals and what they do, we've got a millipede up in the corner here, a picture of a millipede. They're important detritivores in the decomposition cycle. You've got pollinators, which often get into the news because they've been under significant declines. We've got animals like ladybirds that are really important in biological control. They're important predators of aphids. And then we've got birds that also fulfill that role as well. Okay, so biodiversity is really important for underpinning how ecosystems function. And if you have a functioning ecosystem and each functional role supported by a range of different species, not just one species, then you have both a healthy ecosystem and you have a resilient one. And that kind of is relevant to the things that Sven was talking about, particularly about climate change. If you're going to have an ecosystem that is resilient to any changes, including climate change, you need to have a healthy ecosystem. So you need to have lots of species carrying out the main functional roles in that ecosystem in order for it to persist into the future. So in terms of biodiversity and sustainability, that's what we mean. We mean a healthy functioning ecosystem that can be enjoyed and used by future generations. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of some research that I was involved with, well, about 7-8 years ago now, a bit longer ago, just before I came over here to work at Edge Hill. And it was part of a big research project that was exploring forest biodiversity, and it went on for about 12 years actually. And I did my PhD as part of it, and also part of a postdoc before I went off to Canada and do some work there. And an element of it was looking in the canopy. And as Sven kind of highlighted, it's really hard to get up into the canopy. And it really is one of the areas we know hardly anything about in the UK and in Ireland. You know, you see forest canopies all the time, but we don't know much about what lives in them in terms of the invertebrates, the arthropods, which is the area I work in. Okay, so bit of a background to forestry in Ireland, although this is very similar to the UK in terms of forest history and what the current forest cover is like. So Ireland's dominated by agriculture. Forest cover is around about 12%. And there's a large area of peatland cover as well. Of the forest cover that they have in Ireland, the majority of it is plantation forestry, and only around 10% is semi-natural woodlands. And the semi-natural woodlands, they are about, well, as I said, 10% of the forest area, about 1% of the overall land area, and they're all in small patches. So the majority of them are less than 10 hectares in size, and they're embedded in this matrix of quite intensive agriculture. And this aerial photo here of one of the sites that we had is a good example of that. So it's a small patch of woodland surrounded by relatively intensive agriculture. The majority of the species that you get in the semi-natural woodlands of Ireland will be broadleaf species, so dominated by oak and ash, birch with understory of holly and hazel. There are some native coniferous species in very small patches, so yew, juniper, and I put Scots pine ? Because it's debated whether it's a natural species or whether it was lost after the last ice age. They're not quite sure. From the 1950s onwards, there was a major programme across Ireland, and same in the UK, for afforestation. So establishing plantation forests on unplanted land. This happened typically in upland areas. So the beautiful peat bogs that are really, really important for, that we now know are really important for carbon storage and for combating climate change, were drained and trees were planted on them. Typically non-native species that grow quicker and in monoculture. So by that I mean just one tree species. And the aim in Ireland was to increase national forest cover to about 14.5% by 2030. And last I heard, they were still on track for that. So they're still expanding, although they're no longer planting new forests in peatlands. You'll be pleased to know they don't do that anymore. So the typical forests look just like this picture here, and you're probably familiar with this if you've been in plantation forestry in the UK. So the majority of it is a species called Sitka spruce, and it's originally from, well, its native range is the northwestern seaboard of North America, so British Columbia, Oregon, Washington states. And that's where it's normally found. So it grows quite well in Ireland and in Britain because it grows quite well in fairly wetter climates. We also plant quite a bit of Norway spruce, European and Japanese larch, and lodgepole pine, which is another North American species. And these species are softwood timbers, and they go into typically things like wood pallets and packaging and all that sort of thing. They're managed on a 40 to 50 year rotation, and they get thinned out at about 20 to 25 years. So they originally plant them at a 2 by 2 meter distance, usually, in terms of density. And then as the trees grow, they start thinning out rows, and in between the rows to leave, the bigger trees to grow up and under reduced competition. And then at the end of the 40 to 50 year rotation, they get clear cut. So they all get removed and then replanted. There's no natural regeneration of these species. It's all planting. So that's the situation in Ireland, and as I said, it's quite similar over here as well. So because this is quite an unknown area, we wanted to go in and look at some fairly basic questions. So because most of the forestry in Ireland or most of the forest cover in Ireland is plantation, we've got very little native forests. We were very interested in whether these plantations could support the range of canopy invertebrate species that you would find in native forests. So do they have a role there for supporting forest associated species? That was one of the first questions we're really interested in finding out, because that's important to know. And then we also had a secondary question, which was about particular forest types. So going forwards in Ireland, because they're expanding their forest cover and maintaining what they already have planted, they'll be having successive rotations. So the first rotations of forestry planted in the 1950s would have been cut down in the late 90s, early noughties, and then the next rotation is now about halfway through. So we're into the second rotation now, and going forwards there'll be third and fourth. And when you're planning forestry and thinking about sustainable forest management, it's important to remember that the timescales you're thinking of are the rotation of the forest, and that's a commercial rotation. Actually, Sitka spruce will happily live for a few hundred years, but the commercial rotation is 40 to 50. That's the time span you're thinking about and planning about in advance. And we're really interested in how these second rotation forests supported different species. So we set up a study to kind of look at this from the point of view of the canopy assemblages. So we had a range of sites that we selected across Ireland. There were 30 closed canopy forests, so that means that they were kind of between 20 and 50 years old. So they had a substantially developed canopy, and we had 2 different species that were semi-natural woodlands, ash and oak. Then we also looked at closed canopy Sitka spruce in first rotation, closed canopy Sitka spruce in second rotation, so that had been cut down and replanted on the same site. And then also we managed to find enough Norway spruce plantations to have a look at those as well, to see what was looking at those. And this was the first study that had been carried out in Ireland, and it's also the biggest study I think to date that's been carried out across the British Isles in UK forests in terms of this number of sites in a study. So how do we go about this? Well, Sven mentioned canopy fogging, and that's the method we used. So we took the approach of staying on the ground and firing some things up to try and make the invertebrates come to us. And this was part of my colleague Rebecca, or past colleague Rebecca Martin's PhD project, and you can see the picture of her there in her full get-up, looking great, protecting herself from the pesticide. This is the canopy fogging machine that we used, and it's a petrol-driven machine, and you put in a type of pesticide into it that kills invertebrates, and we used a natural pyrethroid called Pibufin 33, and we selected that particular one because it's not persistent, so within 24 hours it's broken down as it gets mixed with water and rain and that kind of thing. It doesn't affect the plants, and it's not harmful to vertebrates unless it's in really, really high concentrations, which it isn't, because when the fogger works, it effectively mixes the fog mixes with the insecticide, so it's just tiny little droplets that get sent up. We selected an area within each forest to fog, and we fogged it for about 6 to 10 minutes to ensure full coverage of the canopy. We had to make sure it was done away from water courses because it actually didn't break down as quickly if it went straight into water. The biggest issue we had with this is that it requires very, very low wind and a dry canopy. So that means a dry overnight conditions and no wind. That's difficult in Ireland. I'm just going to leave that there. If you've ever tried to do field work in somewhere that's a bit wet, it took us a long time to get enough sampling days. And actually, we originally planned to do more field sites and more samples than we had, and we just couldn't get them in to the field season because it was a very wet summer the year we did this. Okay, so what did it look like? You can see Rebecca there in the background, and there's the canopy fog going up. And we had a series of collecting trays set up round a focal tree. So we had 16 plastic sheets. The focal tree is that dark green colour in the middle, and then you can see how we arranged the plastic sheets suspended above the ground to prevent any ground-dwelling invertebrates from jumping in and messing with our samples. And then you can obviously see there was other trees around as well. So we had a combined sampling area in terms of plastic sheet of about 24 metres squared. So we sampled for 10 minutes, and we leave our collecting trays in place for about 3 hours. And over time, the insects and the invertebrates that have been killed up in the canopy will slowly fall down. Okay, so get dislodged by the wind, and they'll slowly fall down into the collectors. They land in these plastic trays, and then we use a small paintbrush to sweep them into a little pot with some ethanol. So what did we get? Well, lots of stuff. Okay, so We had over 1,000 individuals of beetles and spiders each in 144 species. So we're really happy with that. We had 42 species unique to plantation of spiders and beetles, and 59 spiders and beetles that were unique to woodlands, the semi-natural woodlands. We also collected everything, but we also counted the number of Diptera, which are true flies, and Hemiptera, which are true bugs, which includes things like aphids, shield bugs, leaf hoppers. And we counted those, and that number isn't a typo. We did get 142,000 individuals that were counted into 71 families. For obvious reasons, we couldn't take them any further because there was far too many to ID them to species. But 71 families is a really big number. So that's a lot of stuff and a lot of material that we had to work with. Okay, so a few quick results. For the species data for the spiders and the beetles, this set of graphs, we've got the first column are beetles. So top left, we've got the number of forest specialist beetles. And as you can see, we've got more forest specialists in our ash and oak woodland than we have in our first and second rotation, which is that's A4 and Re4, and also in Norway spruce. And we have a similar pattern if we look at all species, so not just forest specialists. With the beetles, which is the graph in the bottom left, we have significantly more in the ash and the oak woodland. Then for our spiders, different picture entirely. So spiders is the second column. So we've got top right, that's the forest specialists. There's no significant difference in any of those forest types, and the same for all species when you take into account the generalists as well. So something going on with our beetle species, but spiders, nothing going on there. Same number of species. For our Diptera and Hemiptera, we had metrics of the family richness, so that's number of families, and also the abundance, that says family abundance, but I think that's actually number of individuals, so the total number of individuals. And as we can see on the left-hand side, we've got significantly more families found in our semi-natural woodlands than we have in any of our plantation forests, which don't differ from each other. And if we look on the right-hand side in our numbers, we can actually see the opposite trend, which is kind of interesting. So we can see that there's significantly more individuals found in our spruce first and second rotation than there is in Norway spruce, ash or oak. Okay, so that's just one element of the fauna there, and that's one way of looking at how biodiversity changes. But it's also important to have a look at what the actual identity of those individuals are. So it's not just about the numbers. More doesn't always mean better. And what you want to know is, are they different and different species? Because then you'll know if you've got particular specialists coming into a particular habitat. So in order to do that, we looked at how our assemblages changed in our different forest types. So this is a type of analysis called an ordination. And each one of the small spots, if we look at the beetles one on the left, each one of the little round spots is a forest, and all of the individuals of beetles from the different species that were captured and identified in that forest. And what the analysis does is it arranges them in this two-dimensional space based on how similar they are to each other. So if you have two of those points very close together, then they support similar species. And if they're far apart, then their communities are really different. So if we take a look at the beetles first off, we can see that both our oak and ash woodlands, and you remember they supported similar numbers of species and higher numbers of species than the plantations. They support different species as well, different from the plantations and different from each other. Okay, whereas when we look at our three plantations, first and second rotation, so that's Re4 and A4, and Norway spruce, they're quite similar. There's a lot of overlap there. So Norway spruce and our two Sitka spruce forests. For spiders, slightly different. We find that ash has a different assemblage, but oak is kind of a midpoint in between the ash and all of the plantations, which completely overlap each other. So something slightly different is going on there, but interesting, because you'll remember that they supported the same number of species. So each of these forests for spiders have the same number of species, but the actual identity of the species do differ. And then when we look at our Diptera and Hemiptera families, we find that we have something different again. So for Diptera and Hemiptera, we have oak and ash clustered together, so they have the same set suite of species or communities in there. Norway spruce is distinct, which is the first time we've seen that. We don't find that with spiders or beetles. And then we get our Sitka spruce and of two different rotations clustered completely together. And that's interesting when you think about what these organisms actually do in these environments. So Diptera and Hemiptera contain a lot of species that are herbivorous, so are much closely tied to host species. So it makes sense to a certain extent that they might be a bit more specialised by forest type. Although, as you can see, for oak and ash, there wasn't much of a difference. Spiders are more generalist predators, and it's more important to them what the actual structure of the vegetation is like, and they depend on that for the type of web they can build. So where you've got major structural differences in a canopy, like oak and ash versus spruce, which is needles versus bigger leaves, that's where you get kind of a difference. And beetles are sort of somewhere in between. So beetles, some of them will be herbivores, some of them will be fungivores, eating fungus, some of them will be predatory. So you've got different species there with different associations. So I've probably talked through most of this already. I'm just finishing up now, I'm conscious of time. So overall, we find that plantations support fewer numbers of species and families in semi-natural woodlands. There were some differences between the two spruces, which is interesting. So we're getting different fauna coming in there. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I think warrants a bit further exploration. No difference between first and second rotation Sitka spruce. So once you cut down a forest and replant, even though in the wider landscape there's been forest there for a long time, it doesn't seem to provide any benefit there. You really are sort of starting again. And we found that Sitka spruce plantations had far greater numbers of total abundance of invertebrates, and that's just due to the vast numbers of aphids and midges that we found. So aphids and Hemiptera and midges are in the Diptera group. So spruce, lots and lots of aphids in there. So spruces in general, limited benefit in terms of supporting species that are typical of a native forest. But there are large aphid populations, which might lead to some issues if you get an outbreak. But when you have a mature tree, they don't tend to lead to too much damage, because a mature tree won't be in too much trouble from having lots of aphids. But importantly, we've got some evidence from another research project I was involved in that looked at birds, that actually they provide quite a nice abundant food source. So you've got these trees on this land that otherwise might have been intensively grazed agriculture. Actually putting the trees on and providing this food source for these birds might be a nice thing or a good thing. But really, if you want to have more progressive forestry management, you need to diversify the canopy. So you either got to have a mix, or you've got to have a mix of stands across a landscape. You're more likely to increase productivity and resilience to pest species in particular, but diversify your canopy fauna as well. Right, and with that, I better finish up because I'm conscious of the time. Just thanks to everyone. This is everyone that was involved in that research project. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Sven. Now, it's my first vaccination tomorrow. And if there's one thing that webinar has taught me, it's that COVID needs to stop now so that we can all get back out there and start doing field work again. That was what we call a content generous webinar. Very well done to Sven and Anne for packing in quite so much in a very short space of time. And a really interesting take on forest and forest canopies and their inhabitants, and the other pressing issues around and about forest environments and their needs in terms of sustainability and so on. We are pretty pressed for time, and I'm conscious that students and some staff like me will have teaching commitments to get to later on today. I don't know if Sven and Anne may be willing to stay on a little bit later than 1 o'clock to continue informal discussion, but there is just time for 1 or 2 questions if anyone is has comments or questions they'd like to make. Any offers? Dan, please. Can you unmute?
Yep, there we go. Sorry, just getting to the button there. Excellent presentation, guys. Really interesting content. So thank you both. Just a quick question that I'd thought of around the rewilding projects that are becoming hugely popular at the moment. I just wondered, what would you say would be the priority kind of techniques in consideration of those rewilding projects to ensure sustainable conservation? So rather than just get the kind of blanket approach of planting all these trees, what should be the key considerations at the start of those projects?
Okay, I mean, I think from my perspective, I guess rewilding is different from sort of planting trees. So there's 2 major things going on in the UK at the moment. There's, well, 2 major things being considered. Obviously, one area is the rewilding, which would be let it happen on its own. But I know a lot of the major rewilding projects are more interested in maintaining open spaces than letting forests come in. And if you just let forests come in on their own, they come back very dense, and they don't typically have the open spaces that you might expect in a more natural forest, or at least what we think natural forests were like in the UK, because we don't have the big ungulates now, and not all of the rewilding projects get that right. But the major thing that's going on across the UK at the moment is major afforestation planting. So the Northern Forest, locally, like the Mersey Forest, that joins up. So they're looking to join up the whole of the north of England in a big forest area. And I think the thing and there's a range of benefits there. It's not just about biodiversity, it's about carbon capture, and it's about, they're planting a lot of them in streams and things like that, well, the edges of streams. So it's looking at preventing flooding in a lot of places and that kind of thing. And I think the major thing they really need to think about is where they're putting them and potentially where they need to remove them. So we've got trees on peatlands, and we'd be better off restoring peatlands and taking the trees off. And that's not necessarily a popular thing, because that's where a lot of our plantation forestry is, because that's where we put it in the 1950s. And we need to be very careful about that, because the research is quite clear that actually the carbon capture from the peatland is better than from a plantation forest, that's for sure. But I think for me that the key things are where you're going to put these new forests, and I'm not quite sure it's being thought through clearly. I think one of the best places to put them is highly productive agricultural land, which is a really unpopular decision, but in terms of biodiversity and benefits for people, so not necessarily the economic strand of sustainable management, but the social and environmental one, a good place to put them is actually where you have a lot of intensive agriculture right now, because they'll do a better job on preventing flooding, and they'll also be you'll be able to get lots of native species, because our native broadleaf species won't necessarily grow in upland areas. They'll grow in lowland areas that are good for agriculture. And they'll also be much more accessible for people. So it depends what you want them to be, I think is, yeah. And I think that's a confusion at the moment, is I'm not quite sure the vision is whole encompassing, and it hasn't set out what do we want our forest to be. I don't think anyone's actually asked that, or at least tried to address it. Sven?
Yeah, so we have the issues with regards to making sure that it's not competing against other economic and biodiversity needs we have as well. I mean, if you, as Anne said, if you were to plant forest on agricultural land, you know, you're directly competing against our food production systems, which again we actually quite reliant on. So there's no easy answer to this.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now after 1 o'clock, just after 1 o'clock. Let's try this. Can everyone please unmute? Can everyone unmute? Let me have a look. Yeah, we've got some unmuting. So finally, then we'll close it off today. We're just after our formally close it off. And if anyone has any questions, they may be able to direct them to Sven and Anne afterwards. But to you, Sven and Anne, thank you for a really interesting, delightfully illustrated webinar this afternoon on a very important topic, something dear to many of our hearts in SustainNET and in the environmental movement more generally. So please, let's try this. Join me and thank Sven and Anne for their talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I can hear, we're going to do better next time. We're going to okay, just before we go, I'm pleased to let you know that we have another webinar next week, Wednesday next week, same time, 12 to 1 p.m. from Dr. Andrea Bullivant of Liverpool World Centre, who's talking about sustainability through the lens of development, education and global learning. So that's it for today. Thank you all for coming along, and thanks to Sven and Anne.
Thanks, Paul, for sharing.